how can they have stolen the election from Trump, but they also didn't make sure to like steal it from all the other Republicans on the ballot? Or like,
Yeah.
why didn't they steal it in 2024, right?
Welcome to Signal Fire. Hi, everybody. Lisa Senegal here, and welcome to Signal Fire. Great to see you, John.
Good to see you as well, Lisa.
And today, I'm really excited to have Justin Glawe here. A federal judge in Atlanta ordered the Trump Justice Department to officially name the 3 Georgia officials whose unfounded election fraud claims led to the FBI's January raid on a Fulton County elections warehouse. 2 members of the state election board, 1 Fulton County commissioner, all of them public figures, all of them longtime election skeptics, all of them fighting to keep their names redacted from an affidavit. The reason that we know about all of this is because of our guest today. Justin writes American Doom on Substack, also has the same YouTube channel, and his outlet was the only one in the country that filed first to unseal the affidavit, and the only one that pushed to get all of the names. So, Justin, thank you and welcome.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Walk us through what happened in federal court on Monday.
Well, the judge ordered that the DOJ, it's kind of weird, unredact the identities of witnesses who we already know who they are, right? It's kind of bizarre to think about. But, for folks who aren't as in the weeds with it as I am, the affidavit is the document that allowed the FBI to raid the elections warehouse in Atlanta back in January, obviously looking for fraud in the 2020 election, which doesn't exist, right? But the document relies on witness statements, as all affidavits do. And there was 11 witnesses in the document. And you have to describe a little bit who those witnesses are in the affidavit. And so the 3 witnesses that we're talking about here right now, it described them via their roles as public officials. Like it said, witness number 10 is a sitting member of the Georgia State Election Board. Witness number 11, also a sitting member of the Georgia State Election Board. Witness number 3 is a sitting member of the Fulton County Commission. So it did not take that much work to figure out who these people were, right? However, there were other things in the affidavit that were redacted, right? And so, I got with some lawyers in Atlanta and they agreed to help me out. And so we made a motion many months ago to have some of that material unredacted, in addition to trying to get some more information about sort of the roots of this affidavit, right? And through that process, these 3 public officials opposed the unredaction of their identities for reasons that they have never explained to me. So what happened on Monday was that the judge told the DOJ, hey, you got to officially name these people now, despite their objections. So that's where we're at right now.
I want to maybe back up and sort of set the scene for people, because as you say, you're pretty deep in this. We've had a couple of conversations about what's going on in Georgia, but people may not appreciate sort of the significance of this case, of what's going on in Fulton County. And so maybe let's even pop up to a somewhat higher level. So what we're talking about here is an investigation. People will probably remember having seen footage of the FBI bringing out boxes and boxes of ballots from a warehouse in Fulton County. They might remember that, among other things, our director of national intelligence, our spy chief, in theory, was on scene. So a very particularly weird thing.
Yes.
But this relates not. Here we are in May of 2026. This relates to the election in November of 2020. So we're talking about something that is 6 years old, and maybe just kind of set the scene a little bit more for us so people can kind of appreciate what's going on in this case as far as you understand it.
It's a really good point to look at things from a higher level. And here is the most simplistic and highest level that I can think to explain it as succinctly as I can, which is that, to my knowledge, this is the only time in American history that the federal government has come into a local elections office and seized records from a past election. So, like, Reconstruction, Jim Crow, civil rights, like, even in all of those very strife ridden times, something like this did not occur. So, like, that is, I think, a good way of understanding the historical significance and the sort of unprecedented nature of what happened when the FBI seized those materials. And then, let's be clear about the evidence that backs up the seizure of those materials, which is all stuff that has been publicly discussed since the 2020 election in election denial circles. The claims that are in the affidavit are essentially technical errors that occurred in the aftermath of the 2020 election, specifically focusing on like 3,000 ballots that were double counted. All of this was adjudicated in the wake of the 2020 election. Georgia had recounts and audits, and there were mistakes that were made. There were ballots that were double counted. None of that had any actual impact on the outcome of the election in terms of that Trump lost, right? Obviously, Trump sued like 60 times over the results. So like this has all been
Hmm.
adjudicated. So the affidavit that backs up the FBI raid is just based on a bunch of stuff that we've already litigated all of this stuff, right? So that is sort of like the insane nature of what has happened here.
If you're sort of listening to this, well, you might say, well, it's weird and kind of historically unprecedented, but why does it matter? I mean, it's a
Mm.
6-year-old thing, and I think the reason it matters is because this is really about predicate for what is going to happen in the 2026 midterms, and probably more importantly in 2028. Right? It is about creating a sort of cloud of what, at least to the superficial observer, seems like reasonable concern about the election, create a bunch of noise, create a bunch of pretext, and therefore things like the DOJ coming in and seizing not just the 2020 ballots, but maybe the 2026 election ballots, or maybe the 2028 election ballots, and then creating a Bush versus Gore 2000 situation where who can even know? They're in
Yeah.
dispute, right? And so does that seem right to you? I guess how do you think about the rationale for this? It doesn't seem like this is because if you thanks to your inviting scrutiny on this, I went deep on this yesterday. I read all the pleadings, I read the affidavit.
Yeah.
If you read the affidavit on its face, as you obviously have in a lot of depth, it's, as you say, it's both technical, but it's also like very speculative. If
Right.
this were true, it could
Yes.
mean this. If that were true, it could mean that. And of course, none of that seems very well calibrated to lead to any like criminal charges, right? Or civil. Like it's this is more. So that this is not about redressing that. Nobody is going to get
Mm.
punished. Nobody is going to go to jail about that, right? So it seems to me anyway, and this is me. I'm substituting my judgment. I want yours, but like this is about predicate for 2026 and 2028. And what do you think, if that's true? I'd be interested if you agree with that. How do you see it? What's the role you see it playing?
Yeah, that this is a press release disguised as a criminal charge. Like maybe people will be charged as a result of this, but like I can't see any reputable judge upholding those charges. And anybody, first of all, like most of the people who were working there back then are like no longer election workers. There's been a complete turnover at the Fulton, so like, but we saw yesterday that the DOJ is trying to subpoena literally everyone who was an election worker back in 2020. So, and keep in mind that some of these people are like temporary
Yeah.
worker type, you know what I mean? So, but to your point about like the sort of broader motive behind it, I mean, I think that's entirely correct. Look, back in 2020, there was a never issued executive order that was being bandied about the White House that talked about having the National Guard seize voting machines. Okay. That was the plan back then. They never went through with it. Okay. In December, Trump told the New York Times, I wish I would have done that. Right. Okay. So you've
Mm-hmm.
got that. You've got Tulsi Gabbard and the FBI seizing voting machines in Puerto Rico in their search for foreign interference in past elections. You've got the DOJ subpoenaing election records in Maricopa County, Arizona, which is another sort of hotbed. It's a very important county and a very important state, right? So a lot of election denial activity going on there. You've got them looking to do the same thing in Michigan. And then just this past week, you've got Republican lawyers demanding that the Supreme Court basically allow them to purge voters within 90 days of the election despite the prohibition on that under the NVRA, right? So like all of this is about sowing distrust is the sort of buzzword, but like, creating a narrative that like, oh my gosh, the FBI raided an elections warehouse in Georgia. And I will point out the irony of many Americans sort of taking that seriously, whereas like when the FBI raided Mar-a-Lago to get classified documents that Trump illegally took from his first term in the White House, that was immediately dismissed as a politicized Justice Department. Whereas like somehow this is like all above board, and it gives it that sort of air of credibility. The FBI raided this warehouse, therefore some of this must be true. Major problems with elections. We can't trust them. Therefore, if Republicans lose in November, the Democrats probably stole it. Like, it's as simple as that, right?
Yeah.
And it really counts on this either being filtered through right-wing media enough to make it palatable and in a twisted way understandable to the people who are going to be listening to that, or to just ask that people completely suspend disbelief that there were problems in Georgia or any of these other places where in all the down ballot races, Republicans did well, and none of them were questioning whether or not the same ballot that Trump says was fraudulent or somehow manipulated, somehow the votes counted for the members of Congress and the senators and everybody else who was elected. But that one race at the top, somehow they just messed with that one. And I mean, it's so absurd that you have to just be willing not to think to believe this stuff, or to be in such a state of fear that they've manufactured that you really can't think critically about it because you're terrified that things are being stolen.
I think that the noise has been so voluminous that like people really glommed onto this and believed it. But let's think about some of what you said, not only the down ballot stuff, which just fundamentally doesn't make any sense. Like, how can they have stolen the election from Trump, but they also didn't make sure to like steal it from all the other Republicans on the ballot? Or like, why didn't they steal it in 2024, right? But let's take a step back even further than that. Prior to 2020, matters of like election administration and possible fraud and contested elections and all, this was a niche industry and market of people who were either very, very partisan or very, very nerdy in terms of election administration. The average voter knew nothing about any of this. So throughout our history, we haven't had major problems with election fraud. Then what? All of a sudden in 2020, that's when there became all of these problems, to the point where millions of Americans needed to believe that all of this was fraudulent. Like, it just it doesn't fundamentally sort of make any sense, let alone why didn't they steal it in 2024? So there's one other thing that I wanted to bring up on that front that I think is instructive in terms of understanding like the motivations towards narrative that the election denial movement is engaged in, which is that this past week, the Georgia State Election Board had the opportunity to institute hand-marked paper ballots. This is something that election deniers across the country have been calling for years. They don't trust the machines. They don't want anything to do with them. They had a rule that was proposed to them that the state election board could have instituted, requiring every voter in Georgia in November to vote on a hand-marked paper ballot. They did not do it. They probably have lots of explanations of why, but part of my suspicion as to why they did it, in addition to a lot of other things that are happening right now, is that they want there to be an opening into which they can insert fraud claims, because
Yeah.
every
Yeah.
Republican in the country who is a remotely intelligent person knows they're going to get smoked in the midterms, right? So, like,
Yeah.
they want to be able to have the ability to say, well, because in Georgia we didn't vote on hand marked paper ballots, there was probably a bunch of fraud. So that's just a little microcosm of kind of like that broader narrative building that I think is happening.
The defunding of the security that the United States has had in place to make sure that our voting machines are up to snuff, that we have decided to get rid of our election security on a federally funded level. At the same time, we are claiming that there is all sorts of election fraud. And it's just another level of exactly what you were just saying, that they want to leave themselves these openings that you could drive a semi through,
Right.
where you could say, well, we didn't have the security we used to have. And so, God knows what happened in this election, but they're not going to say because we eliminated the funding to be able to maintain the security.
In addition to that, they want to move to all hand marked paper ballots, which means that they have to hand count them. So the very same election workers that the
Yeah.
DOJ is subpoenaing right now because they stole the
Yeah.
election in 2020, the election denial movement in Georgia and elsewhere would like to force all of those workers to hand count millions and millions of ballots because they don't trust. Like, what do you think is going to happen? The same
Right.
people and systems that were in place that you blame for this fraud that occurred in 2020, you want to now put more power and into their hands in terms of a hand counted election, right? It doesn't make any sense.
I mean, it's such an interesting framing of this, because ultimately all complicated systems in modern society depend on public faith in them, right? You put money into your bank,
Yeah.
you don't know what happens to that money, right? And we built an infrastructure of trust and a kind of reasonable chain of inferences that people can make so that they have faith in systems, because they can't see them, they don't have the expertise, right? And this is true at almost every level. It's true in the medical system. Why do you get a little orange bottle from the pharmacist, you put it in your body?
Yeah.
Why do you do that, right? Because you believe in a chain of activities that give you reason to have faith in it. And what it turns out here is that this complicated system, and I've spent a lot of time, I've done a bunch of voter protection legal work in the last number of elections, and I've spent a lot of time in Georgia and Georgia counties and in the counting rooms, and that kind of stuff. Is that as a practical matter, there are so many steps. There's risk limiting audits, and there's people of two different parties observing things, and all kinds of things. There's post hoc sampling audits. There's a lot of reasons to have faith in the system, but that's pretty complicated. Well, in the end, the way the walking around heuristic that people use is, it seems trustworthy, more or less, right? And it's very, very easy. It turns out it's very, very easy to undermine that, right? You can pick one little example, even if it's not a real example, right? You can take these things like the FBI. Why did they do that, as you say, as a kind of press release, right? The cameras were all there and everything, right? Because you want to create. This is not about the reality. It's about the perception. And
Spectacle.
I think the thing that I'm very worried about is the kind of asymmetric sort of commitment to the trustworthiness of our electoral system. One party needs for you to believe in it, and the other party needs for you to not believe in it, right?
Right.
And the incentives there are really bad, because it's way easier to get you not to believe in something than to get you to believe in it.
Yes.
And I wonder what you think as you look forward to, maybe it'll be a blowout, but it's not going to be a blowout everywhere in 2026. You're going to have some very important elections, probably the Georgia Senate election is an example, that are going to be very close. And I wonder what you think election night and the days following that are going to look like in the counties and in the places where the election is close in 2026 and 2028.
Oh, I mean, I think it's going to be lawsuit crazy. You know what I mean? I think it's going to
Yeah.
be both sides are going to be ready to go, to basically contest the results of an election. And then, of course, with that, like not only does one side, the Democrats, sort of have to rely on trust in our election systems because they are generally trustworthy, but like they also, in my opinion, like they also like rely on like the truthfulness of that belief, whereas like Republicans largely sort of like they have understood for a very long time that fear is a fantastic motivating factor to get people to go out and vote, right? And people are, in the last 6 years, you throw fear on top of fear of my vote not counting. Now you've got a perfect storm for a high voter engagement, right? So, like, look, I think that in the immediate aftermath of the election, you're going to see lawsuits that are parroting a lot of the claims that are in the affidavit and many more, which, by the way, talking about your sort of getting lost, in the details here. Like people hear things like, well, there are three, there's this guy in Georgia here that claims there's all these illegally registered voters, right? And, you could
Hmm.
just put numbers out there, man, and people will just go with it. You know what I'm saying?
Hmm.
And then
Yeah.
like you dig a little bit deeper and you're like, oh, wait a minute, this is a little bit more complicated than 315,000 illegal voters in Fulton County alone, right? Like that is a salacious claim to be making. You start digging into it and what you realize, why are all these people registered at a UPS place? Well, sometimes homeless people need to register to vote and they don't have a home address, right? So like there's a
Hmm.
possible explanation there. So you're going to have those claims being inserted into contesting of election results, both by state political parties, the RNC, election denier groups, and then potentially members of Congress who have the Federal Contested Elections Act to rely on in terms of certification of the votes once they're counted, right? So, it's potentially going to be a really big mess, and it's we'll see. Once again, it'll be a sort of another proving ground for Republicans to either sort of side with truthfulness and trust in systems, or use that mistrust to their advantage, right? They'll
Hmm.
have another chance to sort of make that decision for themselves.
So there's such a time warp feeling constantly with the rate of the news cycle now, but it really wasn't that long ago. First of all, that Dan Bongino was deputy director of the FBI, which seemed absurd when it happened. Seemed absurd the whole time, but now to think about it, like he's no longer there. I'm like, Dan Bongino.
Yeah.
But Trump was on his podcast once he was no longer deputy director of the FBI, talking about how he wanted to nationalize the election in 15 places. And most of us heard, and I'll admit I heard, 15 states.
Yeah.
And he did not say that. He said 15 places, which, if I had thought about it a little more, 15 states doesn't really make sense because we don't have 15 swing states. And where would the 15 come from? You heard counties, and I'm really curious why you heard it that way and why that makes a hell of a lot more sense.
All I did was follow the trail, the breadcrumbs that Trump himself had left prior to that statement. I went on his Truth Social that is post from around that time of that interview, and okay, he was, you know, this link to that, to that, to that, to that, and then wound up at, I think it was like an Epic Times report from 2021 that talked about 15 counties. I think most or all of them were in Pennsylvania that were, supposedly ripe with fraud. And that's when I was like, oh, this is where in his mind 15 places comes from, right? Like if you ask Trump right now how many swing states there are, or like how many pivot counties are in those states, I don't think he would be close to having the answer. Maybe the swing states he would know, right? But like he did not come up with this himself, right? He's getting fed this stuff from his algorithms, just like we all are, right? And so, anyway, in that particular instance, all I did was just follow it back to the source. And the source was the Epic Times report that said 15 counties in Pennsylvania. And these were the counties where there was, where Trump was leading, and then he lost his lead because mail-in ballots started coming in, which, again, let's not forget, that was a phenomenon that we all knew was coming, or most of us knew was happening.
Yep.
Because we knew the Democrats during the pandemic were more likely to vote by mail, and therefore those returns would take longer to come in. And that's why the numbers would shift as election night wore on.
And they knew that as well. Trump knew that too.
Yes.
Because
yes.
There's a reason that they were all saying,
interject.
let's stop counting.
Yeah.
We're all done now.
I'll just add one other really important footnote there, which is that the decision in Pennsylvania to not count absentee ballots until after the polls close is a very deliberate decision along the lines of all the things that you're talking about in terms of these places where they want a kind of doubt, right? Because that is not the case, for example, in Florida and in many other states where there's a lot of absentee ballots, and they are counting them as they're received, so that election night, within an hour or two of polls closing, you have a complete visibility. You get in Pennsylvania, you get very large swings because of this very deliberate decision that the legislature has made.
I believe the legislature made that rule and that decision like not too long before the 2020 election. Like the process of what you're describing of counting them after, like that was still being adjudicated as we were heading in to the 2020 election or the 2024. I can't remember, but like there were people who were saying this is a bad idea and it's going to result in this. So like, whatever, but like the right has been really good at like, well, that's not why this happened. It was fraud, right? So anyway,
those 15 counties, and I don't know every one of them, but they're going to be the counties in and around Philadelphia. They're going to be the counties in and around Pittsburgh, right? They're going to be urban places where there are higher minority populations, higher Democrat populations. I think when you combine what we're talking about here, right, this idea that we would nationalize the election in 15 places, right? It's Wayne County, Michigan, right, where Detroit is. These are the places with the highest African American percentages. Let's be very specific. It is black votes here that are at issue in these metros, and maybe in Arizona it's Latino votes, but it is primarily black votes that are at issue. When you combine that with what's happening right now, post this decision, the Supreme Court decision with the Voting Rights Act, where we're basically state legislatures across the South Tennessee are what they call cracking and packing. They basically break these districts apart in order to take majority black cities, spread their black votes into larger white districts, so that you end up with Republicans representing places where the significant majority of people are Democrats and are African Americans, white Republicans representing black Democrats.
Yes.
It is a kind of, in this period of rolling back to a pre-Voting Rights Act, arguably a sort of Jim Crow era attack on black votes.
Right. Yeah, and look, I mean, listen, what I'll say to that about the election denial movement and all the people that I've written about and tracked for the last 6 years is that, like, under the guise of we're trying to crack down on fraud, what they really mean is that all elections should be run by people who pass a litmus test of white Republican conservatism and who support Donald Trump, right? Like, if you do not pass those 3 or 4 criteria, then you do not get to administer elections in any way, shape, or form, right? It is never the places that vote that way that are looked at as potentially fraudulent places. It's
Yeah.
always Fulton County, Georgia, Wayne County, Michigan. It is majority minority voting districts. So,
Yep.
you make a really good point that is, directly analogous to what's happening with the redistricting as a result of the Supreme Court decision last week.
To jump to another really important subject, you've done some great reporting on ICE, and in particular the number of people, the historically high number of people who have died in ICE detention in the past 12 or 13 months.
Mm-hmm.
38 people, I believe, 6 suicides. This is the high. We started counting back in 2018, and this is much higher death rate than we've ever had before of people in custody. Tell us about, in particular, Victor Diaz. He was picked up in a Minneapolis suburb in early January, no criminal history, and 8 days later he was dead at a detention center in El Paso. And instead of letting the medical examiner do the autopsy, the Army stepped in.
Yeah.
What does that mean to you when these sort of things happen?
It took a while to sort of straighten that out. But where Victor was detained is kind of an anomaly amongst our growing, immigration detention centers, in that there is a detention center on an Army base, Fort Bliss in El Paso. And so, I still have not really ever heard a good explanation from either the local authorities or the Army or DHS, who I sent them all very detailed questions for the story that you're referencing that came out at the Guardian, I think, last month. But, essentially, the Army says because there's a detention center on their base, that they have jurisdiction over any and all deaths on that base, and therefore need to perform Victor's autopsy. But prior to Victor, that had not been the case. And what made this stand out even more and raised even more questions about it was that the death before Victor was a guy named Geraldo Lunas Campos, who initially was said by ICE to either have killed himself, and then, there was some reporting by the Washington Post, and then ICE sort of changed its story to, well, he was trying to kill himself. We intervened, and then he died. And then the local authorities, the El Paso County medical examiner, were the ones who took custody of his body, performed the autopsy, and said, look, he died basically from being asphyxiated, right? So they classified it a homicide, right? So, he dies. He's investigated by El Paso authorities. They say it's a homicide. ICE says, well, it was an accident of some kind, whatever. Then Victor dies. And now all of a sudden, El Paso is not doing his autopsy, but the Army is, So it was like this sort of immediate red flag. Now, I will say that there is nothing as serious of allegations against ICE people in Victor's case as there is in Campos's case. So far, at least, there's no indication that I've seen that his death was anything more than what it has been reported to be, which is a tragic taking of his own life. However, there's a lot of people that need to answer a lot of questions as far as I'm concerned about what is the jurisdiction, who has jurisdiction over this, because independent death investigations, regardless of whether they occur to an immigrant or me or you, are important to have. If you die at the hands of a law enforcement agency, the law enforcement agency should probably not be conducting your autopsy. Okay. In addition to all of that, we still don't really know what happened to Geraldo Campos. And in the process of reporting on that story, I talked to Escobar, what's her name? Veronica Escobar, the El Paso House rep. And she's like, there's video of Campos. Campos is dead. That was months ago. That was 3-4 months ago, probably, when I did that. So, where's the video? And it just speaks to the larger unfortunate case in which, it is hard to get people to care about, frankly, these deaths and these conditions within these facilities.
There is good reason for the American public to be suspicious of what's happening inside these detention centers, unfortunately, because they've made it incredibly difficult for any members of Congress to do the oversight that they have the legal authority to have, to conduct. We have had way too many stories where when there is some injury, not in a detention center, but at a rally or at a protest or anywhere where the public and ICE were coming in contact, and there was an injury to a member of the public, the ICE would get a story out very quickly, or DHS would get a story out very quickly about how it was the individual's fault. And we've seen an awful lot of cases where turns out that was a completely manufactured story, and they were just hoping that's what we were going to buy. How do you see, not necessarily how do we get trust back in this system, but with what's happening now with the limited availability of information coming out of these places and the lack of oversight that Congress is able to conduct, how do we figure out why this death toll is so much higher, and find ways of demanding that whatever is going on that is causing this is addressed? Because beyond the deaths, we're hearing about inhumane conditions inside these places that are they're just unspeakable.
Yeah. Well, I mean, from like a citizenry standpoint, I mean, I think what's happened recently with opposition to data centers is a good example of like how people have decided we don't want this in our community. And I mean, look, there's a lot of the immigration detention centers across the country that aren't going anywhere anytime soon, right? They're massive facilities. They've been there for years. The local government and town and county, are reliant upon them for an influx of money and jobs and infrastructure and all sorts of things. But like where they are talking about, for instance, converting warehouses into new detention facilities, that's an opportunity for people to go to that government body meeting and utilize their time during the public speaking portion of the meeting and say, absolutely not. We are not going to. They've done it for data centers, and they've done it for data centers because things that I would argue are possibly a little less consequential than abhorrent conditions inside detention centers, like the data centers just like uses too much water and power and resources from our community. Valid concerns to be had, but like, I don't know, it seems also at least equally important that like my community not have a detention center that has awful medical conditions where like people are dying. I mean, let's be very clear about what some of these deaths are. Some of them are horrific and preventable deaths in which people suffered at great levels of pain and then died in great pain because we just as a society are like, well, whatever, they broke the law, so they're in there. You know what I mean? Like that's more important that is not in my community than a data center, but like that's just me. So I mean, I think that's part of it. I think that's part of the answer to your question.
Yeah.
I think what they both have in common, at least as a kind of topic of conversation, is public attention, right? This question of how do you manage public attention around systems that are large and largely invisible. And, you think about what happened in Iraq, right? We had people in prison. We had torture. We had a CIA blacks, and it wasn't until the images of Abu Ghraib came out that the public was forced to confront that thing, right? And which is one of the reasons I think your reporting on this kind of stuff is super important. But I do ultimately think we are a visual society. Visual things dominate our understanding. That's why the boxes are being, they didn't have that raid in Fulton County, without lights and cameras and people in their full-on FBI vests, right? They didn't try to do that secretly or discreetly. They did it as a spectacle. The inverse is also true. They are very much trying to avoid the spectacle. Why can't these Congress people go in? Because they don't want the pictures of 60 human beings using one toilet in a cage, right? But those pictures are going to come out because every human being in America has a cell phone. Those pictures will eventually come out, and the people who are going to get them likely are going to be investigative reporters like you, right? Are going to be people who get tips, you get that kind of thing. So this kind of work, I think, is just incredibly important, which sort of is a way of bridging to what the last topic I want to talk about, which is sort of your work and your Substack is American Doom, which is I feel like a lot of this conversation has felt very doomy. And you've got a new book out as well. Your book is If I Am Coming to Your Town, Something Terrible Has Happened, which I think is just an awesome
title.
name. And I would love to I'd love to hear. Tell us a little bit about both about the book and I mean I'd love to also ask you. We're in the business mostly not of doing podcasts, of actually creating a platform for independent journalism and media. Like we're building something called Noodle. That's what it's about. And so we're very interested in, because we believe that the move from institutions to independent journalism is the wave of the future, and it's going to be really important. And so I'm curious, as somebody who both works for institutional journalist outlets like The Guardian and Rolling Stone and other, Zateo maybe is sort of on this kind of new media of independent platform, how you think that's working. So I'd love to hear both about the book and just kind of the business of independent journalism as a real investigative reporter doing important work. How's it going?
Well, okay, I guess, I mean, look, I mean, I started out at newspapers, so like, it seems like a long ways from that. Look, there is a time and a place for legacy media and institutional journalism. When I am able to contact somebody and tell them, hi, I'm a reporter for The Guardian and I'm working on a story about X, Y, or Z, like there is a difference in tone.
Yep.
In that response than when I email somebody and say, hi, I'm an independent journalist. I run a newsletter called American Doom, and I'm writing a story about this. Now, it's the same person who's saying both of those things, but the reaction can be different, right? And so, like, there's a reason that it's important, I think, for legacy media to still exist, because if for no other reason, for all of the bombastic noise from congressional Republicans about the fake news media, and look, they're not paying attention to what Newsmax is saying on a Tuesday night. You know what I'm saying?
Right.
They're all watching Caitlin Collins on CNN just like everybody else in Washington D.C. is. So like, and those places are theoretically, at least, have the resources and the ability to conduct the type of investigations that, like you're talking about Abu Ghraib, can shock the consciousness of America into changing the direction of the country policy wise. What is both troubling and exciting about independent new media is that, like, thinking about Abu Ghraib is interesting, because that to me is like a clear-cut example of, like, we were headed one way, something happened, it got reported on, and we went, no, we're not doing that. We decided that as a society, pretty universally, right? But what independent media has done is that it has made those moments, I think, fewer and farther between, to where, like, something, I'd be very curious to see what an Abu Ghraib looks like right now, because it seems to me like we have those moments all the time. We've got Liam, the kid in Minneapolis with his silly little hat on, getting dragged into the car by guys who look like they're ready to, storm Syria or something. You know what I mean? Like, that's a moment right there that should shock the consciousness of the nation. But instead, that George Floyd, you can pick all of these moments. When they happen, it's no longer, people decamp into their culture war sides and say, well, Liam had it coming because, whatever. Like, they can just make something up, like, oh, well, his parents should have done what they did, then he wouldn't be at Dilley Detention Center in Texas, or, you know what I mean? Like, anyway, like, but independent media has really allowed that to happen, unfortunately. On the positive side of it, it also allows for those moments to reach audiences in a way that maybe legacy media doesn't always do. That there are outlets who are out there putting the picture of Liam's silly hat on and saying you should be outraged about this. So it's just like with legacy media. There's good and bad sides of the coin to the independent stuff that I do as well.
Yeah, it really feels as though to some degree they need each other.
Yes.
And I think we're going to see more and more folks from legacy media supplementing and expanding their reach through more independent means, including being encouraged by their legacy media bosses to be doing more on social media. And certainly, yeah, those big budgets for that really important investigative reporting. It's going to take quite a while for independent media organizations to grow to the point that they have the budgets to have, to have reporters embedded all over the world so that when something happens, you have somebody there on the ground who can actually do the reporting.
Well, and look, I mean, the ICE death investigation is a great example of that. Like I dug into it. I wanted to do it. Obviously, I was very interested in it. I thought it was important work. I was lucky to be able to work with the Guardian on that because they were able to pay me the money that at least halfway compensated me for the 3 or 4 months that I spent on that investigation. Now, if I'm working on that and I put it out on my newsletter only, not only do I not get the reach of the Guardian, but also potentially I'm not going to get the money that I made from the Guardian for that story anyway, which by the way, thank you Guardian, but like I'm not making $1 million a year here, like I really think about journalism as a vocation more than a career. You know what I'm saying? In addition to the journalism, like I do private research stuff for people that like want to know about something. So I'll dig into it. And then, we talk about a fee or whatever. I play a little bit of music on the side.
I want to. You've got a new book coming out, and maybe we'll just kind of close with that. Maybe one last question after this one. But I'm curious. You're telling the story in the book, as I understand it. I haven't had a chance. I just pre-ordered it from my local independent bookstore. So
excellent.
But telling the story of your work, which is pretty tough work. You're going to places where tough stuff is happening, and sometimes whether it's the Las Vegas shooter massacre, whether it's people dying in ICE detention, it's I think it can feel quite difficult. You're out here, a voice crying in the wilderness, and sometimes it feels like probably maybe there's not as much change as you would like to see. So maybe just tell us a little bit about the book and kind of the message there.
Yeah, thanks for asking about it. The book, I both love and hate the book. I want you to love it. I want you to read it and love it and think it's good writing and important work. But the book for me was like something that had to happen. Like I needed to get it out. You know what I'm saying? I needed to do it not just for myself, but because I know that I'm not the only person who is looking at all this crazy stuff and going, this is bad. Like this is, like this is not good for us as human beings. You know what I'm saying? That like, this is what happens in this country on a day-to-day basis and the world. You know what I'm saying? Like, I know that there are other people who are sort of like, looking at day-to-day events, and I'm not talking about now under, Trump's second administration. I'm talking about every day, you know what I mean? For the last 10 to 15 years and long before that, I know that I'm not the only person who looks at those headlines and goes like, my God, there's got to be a better way than all of this, And I just happen to be a person who decided that like, for whatever reason, I thought it was important to go in and like tell those stories. So it's weird, right? It's kind of like this weird, like I think things are bad and I wish they were better, but also like I'm driven to go and like find bad things. You know what I'm saying? Because like I think that like I can't imagine how you make things better without first knowing what the problem is, I guess.
Yeah.
sort of like
Yeah.
deep down. So the book is about that, and I mean, it starts with homicides in my hometown, Peoria, Illinois, and then goes from there all the way up to, like, some of the biggest news events of the last, 10, 15 years that I've covered, and then also deals like with my own, sort of descent into, addiction and, depression and anxiety and stuff. That again, I think there's an allegory there too. It's like I couldn't really find the solution to that until I knew what the problem was.
Yeah.
So anyway, I think that's probably the best thing I can say about that.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I'm looking forward to reading it.
The emotional weight for people who are covering these issues, the mental toll that it takes on people. I don't do the work personally, so I can't say I understand what it's like, but it is obviously immense and not fully appreciated. We sort of see reporters as being separate from the event when they're presenting their reporting, and we don't see them when the reporting's done and a camera's off or they're back in their own private space trying to process
Yeah.
what it is that they saw and the people they talked to. So all of that is to say thank you for
Well,
the work that you do.
Well, also make sure you thank, other people who I consider reporters first responders, like the reporters who operate like I do. I think we're first responders. So also
Mhm.
thank paramedics,
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
cops, and firefighters. And
Absolutely.
a side note gripe that I have, the laws where you got to pull over on the highway for police officers or repulse. First off, anybody getting pull over off the shoulder for anybody who's on the side of the road, but also for paramedics, who I think are truly the unsung heroes of all of
Yeah.
this. Because no matter where I go and no matter what kind of crazy stuff I'm in, at the end of it, there's always a paramedic there trying to help somebody out and save their life and make them better. So anyway, that's my little.
Yeah, no, man. Chaplains that show up at death scenes. There's a lot of people who do that. Yeah, no, it's a great call out.
Well, we can't thank you enough for coming and talking with us today. I am really excited to read the book. I think it'll be fascinating. It's also important. The more educated we are about all of the things that are going on, that is how the change happens. So hope everyone will get a copy of the book when it comes out. It is If I'm Coming to Your House, if I'm Coming to Your Town, Something Terrible has happened. Yeah. And American Doom is the newsletter on Substack.
Yes.
Where else can people find you?
That's probably the best place, because no matter what outlet I'm writing for, I'm putting something at Doom in addition to all of the reporting that I do just for Doom. So it's american-doom.com, and it's a newsletter on Substack. So that's the best place.
Fantastic. Well, we really appreciate you taking the time to chat with us.
Thanks a lot, guys. I appreciate it.